So let's take a look at the Berlin crisis of 1958 to 61. Now, remembering this is the second incident in Berlin. This time it's under or during the time of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, and it begins during the reign of Eisenhower as president of America. Now, as part of the Potsdam Conference, Germany had been split into 4 zones, and consequently so had Berlin. Since then, obviously, you've now got East and West Germany, and then you've got East and West Berlin, following the formation of those 4 zones into 2. So you've got West Germany, which is democratic and capitalist, and therefore so is West Berlin. And you've got East Germany, which is a dictatorship and a communist one, and so is East Berlin. So why do we have a Berlin crisis in 1958? Well, it begins with a refugee problem that's been going on basically since the end of the Second World War, but it reaches its peak around 1958 because Stalin had taken resources out of East Germany in order to claim the reparations from World War II, whilst the west of Germany and the west of Berlin had benefited from Marshall Aid, America's recovery grants to help Europe recover from World War II. So West Berlin had a much higher standard of living than the East because basically things had been taken out of the East, and at the same time things had been given to the West. The East of Berlin was communist and extremely oppressive, and people had limited personal freedoms. This meant that there was a mass exodus, as in a huge amount of people moving from East to West, an exodus of people leaving East Germany, because once you get to West Berlin, you could then have onward travel to the west of Germany as well. Berlin had become a gateway and a symbol of democracy. It had huge propaganda value. Awful propaganda for the East, but fantastic for the West because people were literally choosing to leave communism behind and voting or with their feet for capitalism. The other thing is here, a lot of the people that were leaving communist East Berlin were young, intelligent people, and it was creating what's called a brain drain in the East. It showed people's reluctance to live under communist rule, and educated people such as doctors, engineers, and lawyers were trying to escape from East to West, creating a brain drain. People willing to leave their homes to escape the oppressive communist regime, people were literally voting with their feet. So Khrushchev's not happy about this. It's terrible propaganda, and it's having an economic impact. So what can he do about it? Well, he issues the Berlin Ultimatum. Now, an ultimatum means do something by a certain date or else. Khrushchev saw the solution to the Berlin crisis, or the problem that he has with Berlin, is to force the other 3 powers out of Berlin, and the other 3 powers being Britain, France, and USA. So what does he do? In November of 1958, he demands that the West recognized East Germany as an independent country, but they refused to do so. On the 27th of November, Khrushchev released his Berlin Ultimatum, which demanded that Berlin be demilitarized and Western troops would be removed. Berlin should therefore be a free city. The West had 6 months to do this, otherwise control of the land routes would be handed to the East German government. This had a major impact on international relations. It's very clever from Khrushchev because it actually forces the West to start negotiating with the Soviets. The West see this as a way of the Soviets trying to spread communism, as in take over the rest of Berlin and spread communism into the west of Berlin. Khrushchev, however, thinks it's an important step or essential step to stop skilled workers leaving from east to west. Neither side, though, wants this crisis to lead to war, because obviously we've got the threat of mutually assured destruction lingering over us. So a series of summits were held to resolve the crisis. It's a clever move from Khrushchev because it forces America to recognize East Germany as a country. So what happens at these summit meetings taking place from 59 to 61? Remembering at the start of this, Eisenhower is still in charge of America. So you get the first meeting in May 1959 in Geneva, Switzerland. No agreement was reached. Eisenhower therefore invited Khrushchev to visit him in America. What we're seeing here is a slight improvement in the relations, as we're seeing them negotiating and actually having a Soviet Union leader go to America. So in September of 1959, Khrushchev goes to America, to Camp David in the USA. No agreements were reached, but the Soviets withdrew the ultimatum, or rather extended it. Better relations are established, and showing good faith and good intentions between the two countries. And they, whilst no agreement is reached, they think, I'll tell you what, we'll meet again in a few months and decide further. However, further talks were agreed. However, they're not going to go well. In May 1960, there's a meeting scheduled, or a summit scheduled for Paris in France. However, it's doomed to fail. On the 1st of May, before talks began, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down as it was flying over the Soviet Union. Eisenhower refused to apologize for this. He said it was a weather balloon that had been blown off course. So Khrushchev walks out of the conference with no decision being made over Berlin, a clear souring of the relationship between the two countries. The next meeting is June 1961 in Vienna of Austria. Now, what's important by this point is America has a new president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or JFK. There he is in the picture there. A new president and worsening relations between the two countries. Khrushchev thought that JFK was inexperienced and weak, therefore he could be pushed around. This is partly influenced by JFK's colossal failure during the Bay of Pigs incident, in which he tried to encourage Cuban, or well, supported Cuban exiles to try and overthrow Castro. But we'll come back to that. Just remember what the Bay of Pigs is in the back of your mind. But that failure in the Bay of Pigs is why Khrushchev thinks he can bully JFK during these negotiations. Khrushchev reinstates the Berlin Ultimatum. He says, get out or we'll hand over control of the land routes to the East German government. JFK, though, stands firm. He doesn't back down to this pressure, and so no final decision was reached. The personal relations between the two leaders were strained, and after the meeting, Kennedy then increased spending on armed forces by over $2 billion. This is a clear strategy from Kennedy because it's trying to show that they are willing to go to war over Berlin, even if they're not. That's what they're going to make it look like. So it seemed the West was willing to go to war over Berlin, seeing it as a symbol of democracy. They would not bow to Soviet pressure. JFK wants peace, but prepares for war. He's a young upstart, and this means a change in dynamics. Basically willing to tackle Khrushchev head on and stand firm. So what can the two countries do now? We're in a difficult situation. Neither one wants to back down, but we've still got the Berlin crisis going on. It leads to the construction of the Berlin Wall. Why is it built? Well, what's happening as this tension's been increasing and increasing between the two countries over Berlin, East Berliners and East Germans start to fear that the border will be closed. What this means is, in August of 1961, 40,000 East Germans leave the East Berlin into West Berlin in one day. Clearly now a mass exodus of people desperately trying to get out of the East before the border closes. So at this point, the border is just a line in the street and is easy to cross. On the 12th of August, therefore, 1961, East German troops built a barbed wire fence and later replaced it with a concrete wall through the centre of Berlin. Khrushchev didn't formally order this, however, he didn't stop it either, as he wanted people to stop leaving East Germany and Berlin. It was basically showing how having a city split in two wouldn't work. The impact of this, both physical and practically, the wall cut through streets and even buildings. It goes into one apartment block and comes out the other side. No man's land in the middle was full of troops and machine gun nests. You are not allowed to leave, you will be kept here. The wall was guarded by troops, and the social impacts of it are that families, friends, and neighbours are separated for years. This meant that people are often going to try and cross the wall and escape from one side to the other, usually east to west, out of sheer desperation. Some examples of some escape attempts. The Soviets imprison and kill people to keep them in. It's effectively one-way traffic. This is terrible propaganda for the Soviet Union. It's literally like it's a prison, isn't it? Some people used windows as mattresses to try and jump across the wall, so the Soviets bricked up the windows. As I mentioned before, the wall would go through apartment blocks, so he'd go in the door, take a mattress in, and try and jump out the window. So the Soviets bricked up the windows. The West Berlin Fire Service would actually come through the window and try and catch people, obviously before they were boarded up. And a guy called Peter Fechter and a friend tried to cross the border. His friend was successful in crossing the wall, climbing over the wall and crossing, but Fechter was shot as he clambered up the wall and was left to die in pain for 45 minutes. Nobody rescued him because they were scared that they would be shot as well. So he's just left screaming in pain until he passed away. terrible, terrible, terrible propaganda for the Soviet Union. What's the impact of this on US and Soviet relations? Well, it's tensions and physical division. It showed the Iron Curtain clearly, now a literal Iron Curtain in place. However, it also did reduce some tension, as a wall was better than a war. A wall was better than a war, as we've discussed. Berlin's been a problem ever since the end of World War II, and now we've kind of got a definitive solution to it. We've just built a wall down it. Both sides have wanted to control it, and now we have a definitive, literal divide or line through the middle of it, and it's better than a war. Positives from this for the USA, from their point of view: Khrushchev had been forced to accept that the West would have influence and control within the west of Berlin. They hadn't been forced out. Berlin became an emblem of freedom and defiance, this bastion of capitalism, of democracy, surrounded by the dictatorship of communism around it. From the Soviet point of view, the positives were that the wall stopped refugees from leaving and ended the brain drain. The wall showed how communism would survive in Berlin, and they wouldn't leave either. The negatives, well, from a USA's point of view, they didn't get a say in this, did they? It was done to them, not with them. This wasn't a negotiation. It was done without their say-so. The Soviets had closed the border without consulting the West. Those who wanted to escape from communism couldn't. Those people are now abandoned to communist rule. From the Soviet point of view, Khrushchev had to abandon his plans to unite Germany, and the Soviet Union literally has to lock people into West Germany. Terrible propaganda. Kennedy comes out of this looking like a hero in West Berlin. They celebrated their freedom, and it's fantastic propaganda for the West. This leads to Kennedy's visit to Berlin, in which he gives his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech in 1963, basically a propaganda tour saying, we won't abandon you, citizens of Berlin. We are here for you. America will help you. And all this. And during that speech, he says, Ich bin ein Berliner, which means like, I am a Berliner, as he stands in solidarity with the Berliners. Unfortunately, this also translates to, I am a jelly donut. However, such is Kennedy's popularity and celebrity in West Berlin at this point, nobody really cares that he's misspoke, because he's seen as such a hero. If you watch the videos, the crowds are still cheering.